710 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone, streaming live on KURV.com, 1-800-580-8255, 1-800-580-TALK. We are the home, the only home of scientific conservatism. This is where you'll hear what the truth is, not just blather and listening to people's opinions, but information in which we have done an investigation of issues and get to the heart of the matter, not just the emotional opinions associated with it. Listening to the news and the radio, especially with this fiscal cliff deal, one must suppose that Barack Obama may very well be the biggest liar that's ever been in the presidency. Almost every single word out of his mouth is completely untrue. The fiscal crisis just continues to worsen. The productive sector of society is faced with ever greater burdens, while the dependent class gets ever larger and more demanding. The idea that anything can be done about this is not very likely, because, as listening to the program earlier this last hour, people still have this mistaken notion that what the government is doing is taking money from the productive and then wasting it. The government is not wasting the money. All those idiotic programs that Sergio was discussing, that cost millions and billions of dollars, they're not conjuring the mind of a bureaucrat, congressman, senator, or president that they just came up with. They were paid but through contributions or some other manner to funnel taxpayer monies to these individuals' influence. When you give $500 million to Solyndra, the bankrupt solar panel company, it wasn't that somebody in the White House or someone in Congress decided that on their own that this was a company that was worth funding. It was a direct response to hundreds of thousands of dollars of contributions that the investors and owners of Solyndra had funneled to the government. And so the problem will never be solved by publicizing these things, because the individuals that are doing the funding know perfectly well that it is for underhanded and unsavory means, and that it is nothing other than graft and corruption. So these are criminals. Our congressmen, senators, and president are simply part of a mafia gang. They are simply criminals in this fascist dictatorship under which the country is burdened. And there is nothing you can say or do to them which is going to change anything. Now, let's take a look at a legitimate response, if a legitimate response was possible, by the Republican Party, the pseudo-conservative party. I was reading an article by Pat Buchanan, who's a well-known conservative and someone that I agree with usually. And he was talking about this last fiscal cliff deal, which seemed to come up every 3 or 4 months in this country, the way this country functions. And he talks about what Republicans ought to do in order to try to get the situation, to take advantage of the situation. And he talks about that the president has now, amazingly enough, he believes the president has painted himself into a corner, because he says that there's really very little maneuverability now as far as taxes or as far as reduction in entitlements. And therefore the country will careen down this present path towards fiscal oblivion. and that the Republicans will take advantage of that, as if the Republicans have any idea what it is that they're doing. The Republicans don't. The Republican Party is a combination of ineptitude and graft and corruption, in comparison to the Democrat Party, which is completely 100% corrupt. The Republican Party has a significant element of the stupid. And so there's no chance of the Republicans coming through. But if the Republicans really wanted or had the guts or the brains to do what needed to be done, they could destroy the Democrat Party without too much trouble. They don't have the intellectual wherewithal to do it. In this last election, the bottom line is the Republicans lost the last election in this idiotic electoral system that we have, because they lost the states of Michigan and Ohio. And why did they lose the states of Michigan and Ohio? Because all the unionized voters in those two states voted for Barack Obama, giving him the votes to win the election. Why did those unionized voters exist in Michigan and Ohio? They existed because they were bailed out. United Auto Workers, the teachers' unions, and all the rest were bailed out not by Barack Obama, but by Republican George W. Bush. As an example of stupidity and ineptitude hard to fathom. If the school teachers' unions and the United Auto Workers and all the other elements that were bailed out by George Bush's threatened asset relief program had been allowed to founder, if the school systems had been allowed to shut down and the school teachers thrown out of work, which is they deservedly ought to be thrown out of work, if if Chrysler and General Motors were allowed to go out of business or be purchased by some more efficient company that did not use union labor, then the money and the labor votes that Barack Obama used in order to win the election would not have existed. And so the answer to the Republican dilemma, if it truly is a Republican dilemma, and there's a question whether there is, because the Republicans are as into big government as the Democrats. But the answer, if they're willing to listen, and they're not willing to listen, I can assure you of that, having spoken with them, that they are incapable of, they're really not very bright. That's the bottom line, politically or in any other way. How can the Republicans win an election? It's very simple. Defund the Democrat Party. The House of Representatives is in the hands of the Republicans. Unfortunately, the Republicans are in the hands of John Boehner and other clueless, politically inept individuals. What do the Republicans have to do? It's very simple. Defund the unions. Revoke all the laws which give special favoritism to the unions. Prevent any funding to any union through any means. Stop the federal government from, in fact, prohibit the federal government from using companies which use unionized labor. Defund the public schools and defund these teachers' unions. Stop paying for food stamps. Shut down the food stamp system entirely. That's about 50 million Democrat voters defunded. Shut down the welfare system. Shut down Medicaid, and shut down all Democrat programs. If you shut down the unions, which they can, call in the notes on all the companies that owe the government for the bailout, call in, shut down Bank of America for fiscal irresponsibility, corruption, shut down Wells Fargo, shut down AIG, shut down Goldman Sachs for fiscal corruption and theft of government monies. You shut down the entire base of the Democrat Party. What will those voters do? One, first, they will be defunded and will not be able to spend money to pay for votes in the election, as they have done for every election as long as the unions have existed. The other thing is that all those individuals who belong to the unions, to the public schools, they receive food stamps or on welfare or on Medicaid or any other public assistance, will then come to realize that the Democrats can do nothing for them because the Republicans shut down those systems and the Democrats can do nothing about it. Those individuals will then realize that the Democrats can do nothing for them. And it was the Republicans that hold the purse strings, as they do now, controlling the House of Representatives. Therefore, all the Republicans have to do is do as I have said, shut down the public schools, which of course would automatically increase the level of education in the country, shut down all the unions, prohibit the utilization of union labor, revoke all the laws that require individuals to belong to unions in unionized companies, immediately stop funding food stamps, immediately stop funding welfare, immediately stop funding Medicaid. That will essentially terminate the Democrat Party. Now, how do you know something is going to hurt the Democrat Party? Well, one can imagine that if a Republican had the intelligence to come forward with this program, what the media would say. But the media is in the hands of big government Democrats. And if there was anything that could really hurt the Republicans in this plan of mine, the media would say nothing. But the media, of course, will raise a hue and howl because they realize that such a program would defund and completely emasculate the party of dependency, which is the Democrat Party. Do the Republicans have the sense to do this? No. And there's a couple of reasons why they do not. One is that most Republicans are big government politicians and actually agree with the majority of the things that the Democrats do, especially entitlement programs. Therefore, the Republican majority, or at least the establishment, at the minimum a significant minority of the Republican Party, will not go along with this. And combined with the Democrat Party will make it all but impossible for such a program to go forward. But that should be, we ought to understand that as citizens of the nation. We ought to understand that at this time, this country is run by a bunch of fascist dictators running in an unconstitutional manner and have basically usurped authority by undermining the Constitution, undermining the principles of the nation, and have no legitimacy. It's important for us to understand that just because someone holds a position of president or Congress or something along those lines does not mean that they are legitimate. All politicians, bureaucrats, and countries will want to portray legitimacy. It doesn't matter if it's despotically controlled Cuba, Russia, China, Burma, or anywhere else in the world that is run by enslaving dictators or aristocracies, or by corrupt, thieving, gangster government, they all want to present themselves as legitimate. North Korea wants to present itself as legitimate. And they justify everything they do within the context of the way they function. All nations, whether they are democratic republics or outright dictatorships, aspire to an appearance of legitimacy through a system which masquerades as one of due process. We just heard a little report from Venezuela concerning the issue of the health status of Hugo Chavez, one of the most despicable individuals in the world, and of course a very good friend of Barack Obama. And you heard the spokesperson of the government say that even though the inauguration of the dictator is coming up and the dictator is nowhere to be seen, that the rules of the land, this and that, X, Y, and Z, make it perfectly acceptable for the dictator to be nowhere around and still be inaugurated. Well, is that the laws are made in a country not for the benefit of the citizens, but for the benefit of the government, to protect the government and to keep the government in power. And that is why laws are not universal, but change from country to country. Because every country imposes laws and regulations based upon their particular culture, which will justify the continuing exertion of power over the people by a small group of kleptomaniacs, autocrats, and aristocrats. Every country wishes to present itself as legitimate. They all claim they have a system of checks and balances, which of course are a charade in a cynical attempt to conceal the ongoing collusion among the various components of the government in order to continue the government's continuing enslavement of the people. Here in the United States, the Constitution structures an authentic system of checks and balances among its branches. Each branch has been given the power not only to act, but also to block the actions of every other branch. This is very different from the way most other countries function, in which each branch works with each other branch in collusion in order to empower government and enslave the people, doing so under a mask of checks and balances. Now, in the United States, much negative commentary is made of this system of checks and balances by the useful dupes in the media and the system of education. Purportedly because of the impediments to efficient governance that this system entails, and which is referred to as gridlock. If you listen to the media or to the politicians and bureaucratic class, that there's something inherently evil about gridlock, because the system of gridlock prevents the efficient machinery of government from doing its assigned tasks. What a bunch of nonsense that is. Using the word efficient and government in the same sentence certainly is a contradiction in terms. However, rather than gridlock being the unintended consequence of this system, as it is perceived in the media and in the system of education, it was actually purposeful. It was intentional. It was placed, the system was created for gridlock by our founding fathers as a means to limit government activity, because our founding fathers knew that unbridled government activity would assuredly lead us to an aristocratic or a dictatorship type of government. Our founding fathers intended that each branch of government should guard its powers jealously and prevent any other branch of government from encroaching upon the functions of any other branch of government. So each branch of government would protect its powers jealously and prevent encroachment upon its powers from any other branch of government, and in return, each branch of government would be blocked by every other branch of government from encroaching upon their powers. Ultimately, the most important thing was that no branch of government unilaterally could act outside constitutional guidelines, and therefore government could never function outside constitutional guidelines. This intention has been purposefully perverted through the subversion of the Constitution to where today each branch of government willingly allows the usurpation of power and acts in concert with every other branch in government to justify the illegitimate activities of government, to enslave the populace to an autocratic central government. So corrupt has the thinking of the nation become that this corruption of constitutional intent is routinely lauded. So what are we to do? The Constitution, which was created to structure a government which could not act autocratically and which could not impose its will upon the people in an autocratic manner to enslave the people, has been subverted necessarily so in order for the politicians and the bureaucrats to get their way. Our politicians and our bureaucrats of the United States are in no way different or distinct from the politicians and bureaucrats of any other country, even the most despotic. All politicians are the same because they all have the same psychology. The psychology of your average politician is simply this: they wish to impose their views upon other people. The politicians that populate a government and its bureaucrats have but one desire, and that is to increase the power of government at the expense of the people. The Republican idea, those few legitimate Republicans who espouse conservative viewpoint, and we'll discuss the meaning of conservative and liberal shortly, because it does change from country to country, is that somehow we can reverse the problem. The problem cannot be reversed. It has gone too far down the path of autocracy, dictatorship, and fascism. What are the solutions which are available to us today? Well, they are few, but they're the only solutions possible. One, secession of states from the Union. There is nothing sacred about the Union of the United States. The United States was created. There were only 13 members, only 13 colonies. If there was something sacred and inviolate of the Union, then why wasn't all the states at one time? The very fact that you could add states to the Union means that you can subtract states from the Union. What we need to understand is that the Union of States, which created the United States, was a voluntary association, and that even at its inception, not all states belonged to the Union. For example, Rhode Island did not join the Union for 2 years after the ratification of the Constitution. There is nothing sacred about the union of states called the United States, and that ought to be obvious just looking at the map. Is there something about the United States territory which makes it distinct from Mexico or Canada, which border the nation? Why are the borders drawn in their particular way? It is simply a happenstance. It is simply a circumstance. What are we saying? That somehow there's a territory of the United States which is sacred and ought to be complete as one union of states, and that coincidentally consists of contiguous states? If there was something sacred about the idea or the philosophy or the peculiarity of the United States, then why do the states need to be contiguous? In fact, actually, they're not, are they? Because Alaska is not contiguous, nor is Hawaii. So clearly, I mean, what is it? Are we saying that somewhere in the mists of time that Hawaii was meant to be part of the sacred union of states, and that Hawaii, yes, but Germany, no? That Hawaii, yes, but Canada, no, even though it is contiguous? That Hawaii, yes, and Mexico, no, even though it is contiguous? Do you see the absurdity that there's something sacred about the Union of States? There is not anything sacred about it. The reason the Union of States was preserved through the Civil War was because of the fascist desires of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, in order to maintain central government control. The same reason that China took over Hong Kong and wants to take over Taiwan, the same reason that India and Pakistan fight over Kashmir, the same reason that historically England and France have been at each other's throats in order to gain more territory for their respective kings. It is nothing other than the desire of the autocrat, whether his name be Stalin, Hitler, Lincoln, or Barack Obama, to maintain power over as many people as possible, because that is what politicians wish to do. Maintain power over as many people as possible. And that is the reason the Civil War was fought, and that is the reason that the United States is maintained as a union today. Not because of the sacredness or goodness of the Union, but rather for the desires of the autocrats in Washington, D.C. Going to a break, 7th and KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, back after the short commercial break, 710 KURV. We're back, 7th and KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, where you'll hear things you'll hear nowhere else. Let's talk about the malarkey of political appellation, such as the terms conservative and liberal. I was reading a book the other day about conservatives, and it had a number of chapters, each chapter written by an author describing what they perceived the term conservative to mean. The confusion of terminology is a old practice used by propagandists to manipulate the people. But we're going to go look at things in a rational way. Let's take a look at what the words actually mean. Conservative means what it says, to conserve. In other words, to maintain the way things are, to confine oneself to the existing nature. Like the conservation of matter means that matter in a system cannot be created or destroyed. It can be converted from one form to another, but it's conservation of matter. So conservative simply means to adhere to what's original. Liberal, being opposite of conservative, liberal means acting outside the traditional, outside the original. Now, depending upon what is original, what is traditional, conservative and liberal can mean very different things in the political world. For example, in a communist dictatorship where the government controls everyone's life, their system is based upon government ownership of everything. Therefore, conservative philosophy, adhering to the ideology of their political system, means that a conservative in a communist country adheres to the philosophy that the government controls everybody's life and the government controls all property and means of production. That is what a conservative is in a communist country. Therefore, a liberal in a communist country would be someone acting outside original ideology. A liberal in a communist country would be someone who says the people ought to own something. Maybe the people ought to own their own apartment or their own car, or maybe that production ought to be in the hands of private individuals, of private sector rather than government. So that would be a liberal in a communist nation. In a constitutional democratic republic, as is the United States, what is a conservative? Well, our founding ideology is the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And what is our country based on? Well, our country is based on not where the government is the ultimate authority, but where the people are the ultimate authority. And as such, the people control the government versus the government controlling the people, as it does in a communist society. Therefore, adhering to the original ideology of the United States and its system of individual liberty and independence, therefore, a conservative in the United States is one that believes in the precepts of individual liberty, where the government is limited and where the people are in control of the means of production. So the term conservative means, though the word is the same, has a meaning diametrically opposite in a communist country and in a democratic republic like the United States. Now let's take a look at the word liberal. As we said, in a communist country, a liberal is someone who would like to impose at least some increased level of individual responsibility, individual control over productivity, and to somewhat limit the government. However, in a constitution democratic republic such as the United States, where the individual is meant to be the highest authority in the land, where the people are the highest authority, then a liberal in the United States is someone who believes in increased government control, decreased individual liberty and independence. And of course, that's exactly what a liberal is in the United States. A liberal in the United States is the one that created all the programs in the United States, such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and all the rest, which have enslaved the American people to psychological dependency. The liberal in the United States, different than a liberal in a communist country, believes in increased government control and decreased individual liberty. That's why liberals in the United States are always calling for increased taxation, increased government regulation. And so we must understand that when we're talking about conservative and liberal, when we're talking about political systems, that they are different, that the term conservative and liberal are different depending upon the political system of a nation. Now, what kind of person goes into government? We've already said that the psychology of the average politician is a controlling psychology. Well, let's look at the two parties in the United States. You have the Democrat Party and you have the Republican Party. Now, the Democrat Party is the party of government and of expanding government, whereas the Republican Party ostensibly call themselves the party of limited government. Unfortunately, all those in government. Well, let's take a look at it. There are two people which populate government, two types of people. It's pretty straightforward. You have the careerist and you have the non-careerist. Well, let's take a look at the careerist. What is a careerist? Well, a careerist who believes that politics is a career, and they intend on staying in government for their entire working life. Bureaucrats, all staff members, and the majority of politicians consider themselves careerist politicians. They believe in government for its own sake. They believe that government should be the most important part of a society. Careerists belong to both the Democrat and the Republican Party. Most Republicans certainly are careerists. Orrin Hatch is a Republican. He's been senator from Utah for about 1,000 years. And so Republicans are as careerist as Democrats. Where does the distinction lie? Well, you have the center of the party, which is your moderate establishment, that believes in politics for its own sake, that believes in government for its own sake. They are not, strictly speaking, ideologues. They have no principles. They simply belong to a certain party and espouse the traditional beliefs of that party, but have no intrinsic principles. I don't think anyone is going to be surprised when I say that politicians lack principles. I think we can pretty much agree on that. The distinction between the Democrat and Republican Party occurs at the extreme element. Let's look at the extreme element of the Democrat Party. The extreme element of the Democrat Party believes in ever greater government control. The extreme element of the government party, therefore, is an extension of the centrist ideology of government control to greater levels of government control, reaching the level of total government control, such as communist. Therefore, the extreme element of the Democrat Party, which is the party that believes in government, is communism. Now let's take a look at the Republican Party. The extreme element of the Republican Party is libertarian, because the Republican Party principle is limited control and individual liberty. Therefore, as you go to the extreme of that philosophy, it means ever increasing individual power, ever decreasing government power, leading to a libertarian state with limited government and maximum individual liberty. So therefore, the extreme element of the Republican Party not only is opposed to the Democrat Party, it is antagonistic to the center of the Republican Party. Why? Because the Republican Party center is populated by careerists who believe in government for its own sake. The extremes of both parties tend to be ideologues, philosophically pure. The Democrat side, philosophically pure ideologues, which believes in government, is logically communist. The philosophically pure ideologues on the Republican side is philosophically libertarian. The Democrat center establishment and extreme are pretty much in alignment. The Democrat extreme of total government is very much in line with the moderate centrist element, which is of significant government control. That is why the Democrats function more as a cohesive unit than the Republicans, because the Republicans' extreme ideological element is opposed to the center, and therefore what you'll find within the Republican Party is fractious infighting And you see that all the time between the extreme ideological purists and the central establishment moderate Republicans. And this is why you have this fractious nature of the Republican Party, far less cohesive than the Democrat Party. That is why okay. What does that mean for those of us who are conservatives and libertarians? Well, we're really outnumbered, because the entire Democrat Party plus a significant minority or possibly even the majority of the Republican Party are like-minded big government ideologues. Therefore, the true conservative libertarian in the United States is a minority of all politicians of all those in the political system in the United States, putting the libertarian or the conservative Republican at a very distinct disadvantage compared to the rest. Another problem is the ideological elements of purists tend to be non-careerists. Their term in government tends to be limited because they are more ideologically pure, especially on the conservative side, which believes in very limited government. Therefore, the ideologue on the conservative side, the Republican side, does not look at government as a career, but as a temporary but necessary sacrifice in order to maintain ideological purity. But the ideological purist on the conservative side in the United States does not look at government as a lifelong career path. Because of the structure of the political system favors the careerists against the non-careerists, because government itself is a mechanism to impose control over the people, that is what government does. It imposes control. Therefore, the natural tendencies of government are going to be towards ever larger forms of government, ever greater control, because first, it is populated by careerists, and careerists want to make government a career and make government as powerful as possible, which is natural, and that the actual mechanism of government is to impose control, and therefore the natural tendency of government itself is to increase control over the people by making and decreasing the individual power of the people themselves. So the natural tendency, the natural flow of government, the careers combined with the natural tendency of government in and of itself, is for ever greater levels of control, ever greater enslavement of the people. And that, of course, is the natural history of all governments, is to increase control over the people. The United States government began as a system of promoting individual liberty, freedom, and independence, and as I have stated, through the natural progression of the proclivities of politicians and government itself, we have now reached a level where we are essentially a fascist dictatorship. It's obvious anytime you listen to the media, when the media asks what the president is going to do about the country, about the economy, where in the Constitution does the president have any say-so over the economy? In the Constitution, the president has no say-so over the economy. Where does the leader of a country control the economy? Well, in communist nations, in fascist nations. Therefore, the very fact that we're asking the president what he's going to do about the economy means that we have progressed at a minimum to a fascist dictatorship, because otherwise no such question could be asked. If we were living in a truly libertarian nation, a nation that was functioning under the tenets of the Constitution as originally contrived, then such a question would not be asked. It would never occur to anyone to ask such a question, because we would know that it is not up to the president to determine how an economy functions. It would be up to the people. In a communist nation, it's up to the president or to the leadership, and the people must follow orders. In the United States, it was meant to be the opposite, but because we function very similar to any other dictatorship, whether it's communist or fascist, we are, at a minimum, we are a fascist dictatorship, unfortunately. And it's going to be very hard to break out of it through conventional means. The electoral process has proven itself to fail time and time again. The perversion of the electoral process has made it that the rewarding of votes by politicians to the people is what gets someone elected. In other words, the more gifts that you can give to the people, the more likely you are to get elected. That is contrary to the way the government was meant to exist, but that is the way the government functions today. Therefore, we are a country that functions in an alienated manner from the founding principles. And that's why we have found ourselves in this incredible mess. The deficit is at $16 trillion. That is greater than the entire gross domestic product of the United States. In other words, the entire gross domestic product of the United States would have to be sacrificed in order to pay existing obligations. However, we have many other obligations which have not manifested themselves yet. These entitlement programs, such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps, and all the rest, have within, and all these pension plans, by the way, those government pension plans, have a bill owed in the untold trillions of dollars. Therefore, as difficult as it would be in order to pay off the debt that we already have accumulated, the ability to pay off the debt that is going to have to be paid is impossible. It cannot be done. Now, is there a fiscal answer to all this? Well, yes, there is. It won't be done because the way it's functioning now is exactly the way the government wants it to function, in which the vast majority of money spent are funneled to the friends, cronies, relatives, and contributors of politicians. When they talk about the budget and the deficit, they always talk about cutting spending. And that would be good, of course. But they make it seem as if cutting spending would mean some kind of sacrifice of essential product. And that simply is not true. The vast majority of monies spent go into the pockets of wealthy individuals with political influence. These are not the producers. These are the people that run Goldman Sachs, AIG, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, General Electric, and large hospital corporations, pharmaceutical corporations. That's where all the money is going, into the pockets of these wealthy individuals of political influence. There's more than enough money, there's more than enough production in the United States to pay for everything that is necessary and more without running a deficit if the monies were properly spent. But that, of course, that is not what is being done. The monies are being completely wasted Well, once again, that is a poor term. Not wasted. They're just being funneled towards individuals who are unnecessary, who are not necessary, but who have political influence. That is the system as it exists today. Now, I have to question the productivity of the American productivity. I kind of wonder, because I'm not sure how exactly it works. We buy computers from American companies. We buy cell phones from American companies. But if you look at the stamp on the computer, the stamp on the cell phone, or the stamp on the clothes that we buy, and many other things, it's made in China. So how does that work exactly? Is that considered an American product? In other words, if I buy an Apple computer, is that money that is counted towards American productivity or Chinese productivity, which is where the Apple computer is actually put together? And that is a question that I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the answer is to that, but I would like to know where that productivity is measured. So if Apple Computer is a corporation in the United States and I buy an Apple Computer and therefore give $100 to Apple Computer, that has $100 to the Apple Computer bank, then Apple Computer, I guess, pays money to the Chinese manufacturer that actually built the computer, and I guess that goes towards Chinese production. So is American production counted as me giving money or the exchange of goods or whatever in the United States, even though the product is made in China? Well, I don't know where Polo products are made, for example, if that's an American company or not, but let's just say it is, and I'll look into it. But it really doesn't matter. If it's not Polo, we'll look at some other company. They make all their clothes in China or somewhere else overseas. I give money to the Polo company. Is that considered production in the United States? Is that part of American productivity? Because it's an American company and it gets the money. But then Polo brand pays its Chinese companies actually make the food. So that's part of Chinese productivity, I suppose. So there's a question which I really hadn't thought about too much before. But exactly how are we calculating American productivity, or anybody's productivity for that matter? Have to go to a break. 710 KRV. Be back after the short commercial break. Streaming live on KURV.com. .710 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone, streaming live on KURV.com, 1-800-580-8255, 1-800-580-TALK, streaming live on KURV.com. One of the things that happens on this program is that I start talking about something and a certain train of thought occurs leading to some kinds of logical conclusions. And this happens often, many times. So very often in this program, I will start talking about things like thinking out loud, which I had no idea I was going to talk about when the program started. And now we're talking about productivity. And it occurred to me, how is productivity actually measured? Because when I go buy clothes or, I went to a store to buy a camera. And I asked for a camera not made in China because I think the quality is not as good. they could not find one. You had Samsung phones, which is a Korean company, and phones, and their cameras are made in China. You had Nikon, which is a Japanese company, and their cameras are made in China. So you go down to the store to buy clothes. It doesn't matter if it's Tommy Hilfiger, Polo, Perry Ellis, or whatever. Everything's made in China or Malaysia or something like that. So if I buy a polo shirt and that money goes to the polo company, that counts as part, which is an American company, so that's part of the gross domestic product of the United States. But then Polo pays money to make the shirt, the clothes made, pays money to a Chinese company. And so how does that work? Is the American part of that, is the Chinese part subtracted from the American part, and that's the net gross domestic product? Or how does that work? Because it's kind of a mystery to me here, because the American manufacturing base is disappearing. We have 12 million people unemployed. We have 80 million people not in the workforce. We have 135 million Americans working in an adult population of 250 million. Which means half the population, adult population, doesn't work. Of the 130-some million that do have a job, a bunch of those are in government, so we cannot consider that work. A bunch of those do things which I don't think anyone would consider work or productive work. And so how is it we're able to maintain this level of productivity where our gross domestic product is 3 times that of China, for example, where we have a gross domestic product of about $15 trillion. But how does that calculate it? How does that actually work? Does that really mean something? I mean, how do all these numbers figure into it? One thing we can take for granted, that whatever the government tells you is a lie. Right off the bat, that we can assume that everything the government says is a lie. And so, what is the exact situation in the American economy? We have 50 million people on food stamps. We have 50 million people on Medicare. We have 60 million people on Medicaid. We have all other forms of welfare entitlements. We have a system of public education. So we have everybody associated with that. That's all welfare. So who isn't on welfare anymore? Who isn't on welfare? Now, I mean, what percentage of the United States is actually beholden to the federal government in one form or another? It must be more than half. All your school teachers, everybody in United Auto Workers, so everybody not working is beholden to is dependent upon the United States government, and a bunch of those people who are working are also dependent on the United States government in one form or another. How far down the path of enslavement have we gone? It may very well be a far greater amount than we had supposed before. We may be actually a nation of slaves at this time and not even be aware. The people of the Soviet Union were slaves. And they existed, and they were slaves without chains, without shackles. And they existed that way for 70 years. Entire generations were born, lived their lives, and died under a system of complete and absolute government control. If that isn't a tragedy, I don't know what is. And so that people can live enslaved in misery for their entire lives, generation upon generation, even in the worst of circumstances and environments, is a demonstrable fact. Therefore, how much easier is it to survive as a nation when when the situation is not even as bad as it is in the United States? Are we a nation of slaves today? Would the Founding Fathers recognize us as a country of free individuals? I dare say we are a nation of slaves, and the Founding Fathers would find this nation unrecognizable. So do we live in a matrix? Do we live in a matrix like the movie where you have a vision which is completely fabricated, which is something that we imagine but is not actually true, that we live in an environment other than what we suppose for the benefit of a group of rapacious individuals? It's a frightening thought, but we may be closer to the matrix environment than we had supposed. People are always talking about conspiracies as if there was some group of people fabricating some nefarious plot, when the conspiracies that are all around us, and they're as open and obvious as to anyone who wants to actually see. We're blind to the realities because we don't want to see the reality, because it is much more comfortable to look at things as in a fantasy world than the harsh realities. Much more comfortable to be on food stamps, Medicaid, and welfare than it is to work for a living, which is why with every passing day, more and more Americans are on food stamps or on welfare. That is the sad truth of the environment in which we live in today, unfortunately. So, what is reality? If you think about it, how many of us could survive without government handouts or without somebody doing something for us? We use light bulbs, but how many of us even understand how a light bulb works, let alone have the capacity to develop or fabricate something like that? We use things routinely today. We go down to the grocery store to buy food. But how many of us could survive if there was no grocery store from which to buy food from? We go down to the clothing store to buy clothes. But how many of us could make our own clothes? And so we live in this world of this magical way of thinking. We go around to the store, we buy our shoes, our clothes, our food, our cars, our televisions, our computers and cell phones. They appear to be there magically. We look at it as if somehow they just appear out of nowhere. But what would happen if the people manufacturing those devices should all of a sudden disappear? Where would we be then? Probably starving to death, I imagine, trying to defend, make our way throughout life as best as possible, the greatly decreased lifespan and living in an environment of misery. So why is it we have what we have? We have what we have because individuals such as Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, Jonas Salk, Steve Jobs, Michael Dell, Bill Gates, many others, individuals who through the power of the mind created something which never existed before. That is the amazing thing about human beings. Animals cannot create what never existed. They can only recreate or remake what has already been done. That is why animals live today as they lived yesterday, as they have lived for thousands or millions of years, exactly the same way. Man is distinct. Man does not live today the same way he lived 1,000 years ago. Only man is capable of changing his own living environment. That is the amazing thing about humankind, is that unlike any other species on earth, that man does not need to adapt to his society, to his environment, that man can make the environment adapt to the needs of man. That is why, I suppose, that every type of environment in the world, you will find different types of species that can best acclimate to those particular environments. But humans can be found in every type of environment. And that is because the humans can create, can reform the environment in which the humans live, distinct from the natural environment. Man can live at the North Pole, South Pole, at the equator, at the top of the mountain, or at the bottom of the sea. Man can live anywhere. Unlike animals that can only live in areas that is conducive towards their physiology, but man can remold the environment to suit the needs of man so that man can survive. That's what makes man unique throughout the entire world. And so, what is man? What are we meant to do? What are we meant to be? Look at this. Look at the history of civilization. The rise and fall of civilizations. Why do civilizations rise and why do civilizations fall? Why did Rome rise and fall? Why did Egypt rise and fall? Why did the Greek city-states rise and fall? The Byzantine Empire rise and fall? Why did nations or civilizations which at one time were the greatest in existence disappear? What is there in the natural history of a society which seems to make its process towards oblivion inevitable? What great civilization exists today that existed even 500 or 400 years ago? None. The United States has been in existence less than 250 years. What other great civilization exists? So, what is it that causes civilizations to rise and fall? Clearly, the type of people that create a civilization are different than the people that maintain a civilization, and are different than those who are there for the decline of the civilization. So you have different personality types, which is understandable. The creator is going to be a different personality than the maintainer, than the ones who are in decline. The creator creates, makes something that did not exist before, has a certain mindset that allows the taking of risks, expansion into areas never before seen. Those who maintain a society are satisfied with the way it is and just want to maintain a status quo, which inevitably, I suppose, leads to the decline and then the fall of a nation. Who were the creators of our nation? Well, it was Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Adams, and all the rest, who were the creators of something new, different, and better. They passed it on to those who maintain. And those who maintain are interested primarily in the status quo. But what happens among those in the status quo? Well, one is that they are averse to taking of risks. And so advancements tend to cease. They are jealous to hang on to what they have and are not really interested in becoming something bigger and greater, particularly. And I guess you might say, you're either going forward or you're going backward. And if you're not going forward anymore, then inevitably you'll be going backward. So where are we today in this nation? We are moving backwards. We live in a fascist dictatorship where innovation is on the decline, where more and more people are ignorant and dependent, and where the productive class is systematically penalized for being productive. In a society that rewards sloth, that rewards people who don't work, that rewards ignorance, then you get more sloth, more ignorance, more dependency. In a society that rewards producers, you get more production. So we have a society today that rewards the parasite and punishes the producer. I imagine that's probably the way it was in all other civilizations that disappeared. That the producer was penalized and kept shrinking in size until the producing class could no longer support the parasitic class. And as the parasitic class requires a host in order to survive, and as the host was disappearing, then of course the entire civilization disappears as well. So probably that is what happened to these other great empires, and that is what is happening to the United States. The parasitic class has gained ascendancy. The parasites are rewarded by government. The parasitic class is increased through enticement by government programs. Government does this specifically to increase dependency, because the greater the dependency, the greater the power of government. However, there comes a point when the parasitic class kills the host. And then what happens? If the parasite has nothing to live off of, the parasite itself is eliminated. And I imagine that is the scenario of the fall of great civilizations. The productive class is punished in some way so that the productive class decreases in number, and the parasitic class, who live a life of dependency, who live on a government dole, who depend upon the productive class to supply the means that allows the parasitic class to survive, that they are weakened enough that they cannot produce enough, or they decide to pack it in because why should they work while it is others that receive the benefits of their labor. So at what point does our nation collapse? Well, one thing about the collapse of nations is that it usually happens pretty suddenly. Even though looking at it in hindsight, it may appear to have been something that had been developing for years, decades, or even centuries, but was not noticed, or noticed by very few, that the decline of civilization is simply the progression from the productive to the parasitic. And the fall is sudden. It happens almost immediately, as if, remember, the fall of the Soviet Union seemed to happen overnight for a nation that a few years earlier, in the 1980s, was considered to be so strong and powerful that they would outlast the United States possibly, and that the very philosophy or policy of détente was that the Soviet Union was going to remain an inevitable power inevitably forever without stop, and therefore we needed to be able to function in a world with the Soviet Union. And that was the philosophy of détente, where you accept the permanence of the other government. But it fell, didn't it? The Soviet Union fell. And it seemed to happen overnight, but of course it didn't. So the United States, on its present trajectory, will collapse. And the collapse will appear to have been sudden, without any forewarning. But looking at it historically, it will become very evident that the seeds which led to the destruction of the nation were planted long before the actual fall of the nation. And that those seeds in the United States have not only been planted, they are germinating and growing. And that the fall of the United States, as we recognize it today, is inevitable. In what form it will take, it is hard to say. There will be chaos in the streets and riots as the non-producers, lacking any availability to production because the government has collapsed or cannot maintain handing out of all of this produced goods without repayment. There will be riots in the streets where the majority of the dispossessed will attack those who produce and who have some wherewithal, that they will be attacked for their food, their clothes, their shelter, their car, their cell phone, whatever else. That will happen in the United States, and I think it's going to happen sooner than later. And it will probably, I imagine the United States will break up into regions and almost separate little countries acting and behaving independently, free of other nations or free of other states. And that will be good, because it would be good for every state to be responsible for its own future and not be dependent upon Washington, D.C. Isn't it absurd, and of course unconstitutional, that the people of one state would be beholden as to their survivability on the whims and mercies of people in other states, or on the whims and mercies of the people in government? Is it likely that that is the way the country was meant to be? Not likely at all. So we live in a country that is completely alien from original and founding principles, which is the reason that the country is in decline. And so the question is, at what point will the decline be sufficient to break the back of the camel? But the thing is, when it happens instantaneously, and it will appear to have come with either no warning or very little warning. And that is what I predict the nation will end up as: a fragmented group of territories made up of former states existing as independent countries. This is 7 at KRV Talkback. Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home there. Microphone. We'll be back after the short break. We're back. 7 at KRV Talkback. Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. I'm just thinking a little bit more about this productivity aspect of things and where the money flows. Because so much of what we buy today seems to be made in China. So what kind of a people are we when we think along those lines? You know, we condemn the Germans under Nazi Germany for having allowed what happened to happen, allowing the abuse and murder of human beings without doing something about it. But are we any better? We live in a society that survives on the backs of slave labor. If you look at it, televisions and cell phones and computers are relatively inexpensive considering what you get. You can go buy a great camera for $100, made in China, of course. A camera of that quality, which maybe 20 years ago would have cost $400 or $500. So we live in a society of non-producers with a stagnant level of income, and yet we're able to buy cell phones and computers and iPads and all of that because they're really not all that expensive. But why aren't they that expensive? Because the people producing them are slave labor, getting paid $1 a day or $1 a week or $1 a month in China or some other godforsaken place, working in sweatshops for 18 hours a day, children working for a few pennies a day so that we can have a cell phone or a computer or something else. And so when in the future, when they look at us, will they say, how could the people of the United States have been so callous as to have benefited so much from the production of slave labor? We have a venal political class that has destroyed the productivity of the United States in the name of lawyers, in the name of unions, in the name of politics. But we maintain our standard of living not because we produce, but because we are given enough money by our government to purchase these items made by slave labor. If we had to pay, if the computers and cell phones and televisions and everything else that we buy were made by labor that was paid a decent wage, then I imagine all of these items would cost significantly more than they do. And so we benefit from the slave labor, from the child labor in India, Malaysia, China, and much of the rest of the world. But we are so easy to condemn others for their failings while we go on blithely throughout our day, living in the matrix, unaware of reality. And what will our response be? Oh, we didn't know. That was far away. We weren't aware that in China people were chained to sewing machines for 18 hours a day, getting paid almost nothing, so that the people in the United States could benefit off the labor of Chinese slave labor, or Malaysian slave labor, or Indian slave labor. Because that's exactly what is happening. So we live in a world of myth, pointing fingers at others, while we ourselves are more to blame than anyone else. The United States government creates a matrix because the United States government is a bunch of liars, and it exists for no other reason than to maintain itself and to increase its power and authority. Clearly, it is in the interest of the government that the United States be able to purchase goods made by slave labor. What is the way it ought to be done? Well, we ought to be a land of integrity. There are those who say that not allowing the purchase of goods from China is a restriction of trade and benefits no one. It doesn't benefit the Chinese laborer because then they don't have even minimum anything. And it doesn't benefit the ones in the United States because it reduces competition and it decreases buying power. But is that so? Are we saying that we're willing to put our material needs above our spiritual well-being? That appears to be the case. But if it were up to me, I would say this, that by purchasing goods made by slave labor, we incentivize slave labor. Do we want to be incentivizing slave labor? I would say no. The productivity of an individual is severely hampered by government regulation, government control. Improper education is worse than no education at all. Living of a lie is worse than living under a distasteful truth. If one was aware that the education one received was a lie, it would be certain it would have to learn what the truth is. Being educated by government schools guarantees the perpetuation of government lies. Therefore, no system of education, it would be better than a system of education which exists to propagate lies. So it would seem to me that which allows freedom is better than that which permits slavery. People remain as slaves because it is more comfortable than the alternative. If we stopped buying goods made by slave labor in China, maybe the Chinese people would revolt over their taskmasters. If the United States citizens were not permitted to buy cheap goods made by slave labor, we might see the real effects of government policy upon our economy and productivity, and then respond appropriately, because we would realize that productivity has been harmed by policies of the United States government, and the United States government thus needs to be eliminated from imposing its rules upon society. So I would say this: better not to have something than to have something created by slave labor. In the short term, there may be some pain, but in the long term, aren't we all better off? Because if we do not buy goods made from slave labor in China, then that would be the incentive for people in the United States to produce those goods. Since in the United States, the people would have to be paid a decent wage, that would mean those goods would have to cost more. But I think that would be better than buying goods made of slave labor. Now, the thing is, in an open competition, ways would be created by entrepreneurs, by people with who are smarter, with using ingenious ways of doing things to produce something which would have cost less. The incentive is always there to create something better which costs less. That's the free market. If the government regulations were removed from the impediments upon the free market, then anyone with a better idea would be able to sell their product as long as the government didn't get in the way, which is what it does now. And over time, these products would be created which would cost no more than what they cost now in China. But right now, it's just the easier way to do things. It's just easier to let the Chinese slave labor produce something, just easier for them to produce it and for us to buy it, and to put aside the idea that we're buying things made by children working under slave conditions or adults working under slave conditions. So if it were up to me, I would embargo all goods from China. Why should we be purchasing goods made by China? That's what I would do. I don't see any reason to have dealings with people. I don't see any reasons with dealing with people that use slave labor. Now the question arises, what is a decent wage? I would imagine a decent wage is a wage that allows individuals at a minimum to be able to purchase all the necessities of life, which means you can buy hamburger, but maybe not steak. But what are wages for? Why do we work? What are the fruits of our labor? To be able to purchase what we need. Isn't money just a medium in order to replace the barter system? We work so that we can feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, house ourselves, transport ourselves. So obviously there can be no fixed amount as to what a decent minimum wage is. That it would be a situation in constant flux. If I am working for a company in which the wage that I receive does not allow me to buy the minimum necessary, food, clothes, whatever, then what happens? Well, in my belief is that companies like that will go out of business. That companies that provide a better product that costs less, made by people which are paid enough that people want to go work there, that those are the companies that will survive over time. And I believe that's exactly what would happen if the government was not allowed to be in there skewing what wages are and what the costs are of production. Look, I know I'm an employer, and I know that if I don't pay my employee the same or better than another employer providing the same product, then my employee is going to leave and go to the other person. So in a free market, the company that survives is the company that produces the best goods at the lowest price and has a workforce willing to work. So in a free market, the individual would be allowed to work that is most conducive to them, in a place most conducive to them. Now, to try to figure this out on a national basis is impossible. But allowing each individual to make the decisions on their own, to be responsible for their own activity, allowing the individual to make that decision, allowing the manufacturer to produce without government interference and unnecessary costs, allowing open competition in a free market. I cannot tell you an exact wage. I cannot sit down and calculate out, oh, it ought to be $7.50 an hour, or that a computer should cost $5, or that the shirt should cost $10. I cannot do that. It's impossible. That's why government fails, because it tries to do exactly that. What government tries to do exactly is to determine what something is worth, what someone is worth, what something should sell for, what something should be bought for, and that is why everything is skewed and why nothing functions properly. In a free market, millions and millions of individual transactions can occur to the mutual benefit of the buyer and the seller. And that can only be done when each individual is directly involved in what they buy and each manufacturer is directly involved in what they sell. And there's a direct relationship between consumer and provider. And that can only be done in a free market. And it can be done successfully. And it will work if allowed to do so. That doesn't mean everybody's going to be happy. Not everybody's going to be rich. Not everybody can be a great basketball player. But it will be a society which will provide the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people, and deservedly so, not undeservedly so as it is today, where the government dictates where the flow of money goes, and it goes to the friends of government. And so I say this: what we have shown in the world is the greater that the more freedom there is, the better off the people are. The less freedom there is, the worse off their people are. Therefore, logically, the greater government control, the worse it is for the people. The less government control, the better it is for the people. So let's go on with as little government control as possible. Let each individual be responsible for his or her own life, and stop this system where the government steals from one to give to another in order to benefit the government. We must remember what government and only government can produce, to give you an idea of what government really is. What is it that government and only government can produce? Slavery. Only government can produce slavery. Only government can create a system which allows slavery to exist. What else does government produce? War. War cannot exist without government. Mass murder cannot exist without government. Genocide cannot exist without government. To prove it, when has it ever occurred without government? Can you have concentration camps without government? No. Can you have slavery without government? No. Can you have mass murder or genocide without government? No. Those are the products of government. Now, can one person enslave another? Yes, it's possible. Can one person murder another? Yes, we know that to be the case. But to be done on a grand scale of mass murder, mass incarceration, mass slavery, that can only be done under government. Only government can create an environment which allows that to happen. There's no possible way that slavery can exist on a mass scale without government in there making sure, creating laws and creating an environment that makes it exist. If we understand that, that government is what produces all the great evil, and that all greatness comes from the individual. Who created the airplane? The Wright brothers. Who created the light bulb? Thomas Edison and a few others. The phonograph, the movie theater, the automobile. All these things were made not by government, but by individuals or small groups of people working together independently. But ingenuity of the human mind, the genius of the human mind. These things cannot be created by committee. The individual is what creates these things. And what is government? It is the subversion of individuality to the government, to the community. All greatness comes from individuals. Whatever that greatness is, it comes from the individual author, the individual artist, the individual inventor. That's who creates greatness. So if all greatness comes from the individual and all great evil comes from the government, then doesn't it seem logical that we would want a society that was more individualistic than governmental? Where do we get this idea that there are some things which we need government for? What exactly do we need government for? And if there is anything we need government for, is it worth the risk of genocide, war, mass murder, and slavery, and concentration camps? Is it worth the risk of that in order to get whatever possible things, which I cannot think of offhand, which the government is able to do? I am not aware anything that the government can do on its own which should be better than what an individual can do, unless we're talking about war, genocide, and slavery. Because clearly, if you want slavery, if you want war, if you want genocide, if you want mass murder, then you want government. And so, whatever the government can produce, whatever minimal good it may do, is dwarfed by the dangers and the risks of the malevolent things that government can do and has done to this very day. In Cuba, you're not allowed to leave the country without the government allowing you to do so. Only government can do that. That's the way it was in the Soviet Union. That's the way it is in China. North Korea is a prison state. It can only exist that way because of government. All the inequity of the world, all the horrendous things of the world, all the wars and all the mayhem is created by government. And yet we have this promotion that government is necessary and good. And who promotes it? The media, which is nothing but an arm of the government, and the government itself. But look at American society. American society is being destroyed by the government. The American system of education is a disaster. It produces entire classes of ignoramuses and illiterates. It is run by the government. What does the government do in this country that makes it worth having government? It is true we have a tremendous military. But what is our military doing today? We have American troops in 150 foreign countries. Why? The American Army was built for, is supposed to be for self-defense. Why do we have American troops all over the world? What good can that do for us? So, and another thing is, everything that is great about the American military was created by private sector. The reason the Soviet military was second-rate compared to the American military is because the Soviet military was built in the public sector. It was built by government-controlled plants. In the United States, there's a competition among weapons manufacturers which allows for the best weapons to be built, if that's what your goal is. But that's why the United States has the best military in the world, because we have a military built by the private sector. So in a world without government, well, I can tell you, in a world without government, there's no Holocaust, there's no genocide, and there's no concentration camps. So let's try that for a while. Let's try a world without government, and let's just see what happens. Maybe things will be better. 7 in the care, I'll be talking about Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Thanks for all those who've listened. Be back next week with some more insight to things which I haven't thought about yet. And much of this program today was off the cuff, because when I start talking and I have a train of thought, things kind of just lead off into directions unanticipated, but which often are very interesting, at least in my mind. Thanks for listening. 7 in the care, we talk about Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Holding down a microphone. Be back next week. Back next week. Goodbye.